Ted Bundy grew up believing his grandparents were his parents. His mother, Eleanor, who everyone around him called Louise, was presented to him as his older sister. It was a family secret, common enough in that era when unmarried mothers faced severe social stigma. Ted did not discover the truth until he was a teenager. By some accounts, he stumbled across his own birth certificate. By others, a cousin told him. Either way, the discovery hit him hard. When Ted was 4 years old, his mother married a man named Johnny Bundy, a hospital cook from Tacoma, Washington, and the family moved west. Ted took his stepfather's surname and grew up in Tacoma as Ted Bundy. By most accounts, his childhood looked ordinary from the outside. He was smart. He was well-spoken. He went to church with the family every Sunday, but people who knew him as a boy described a kid who struggled in ways that were hard to articulate, who watched other people carefully, studied how they interacted, and seemed to be learning social behavior rather than feeling it naturally. As a teenager, he was shy, somewhat awkward, easily embarrassed. He shoplifted. He was caught twice and let off with warnings both times. What changed him, or rather, what unlocked him, was college. At the University of Washington in the late 1960s, Ted Bundy discovered that with enough practice, enough observation, and enough effort, he could become whoever a room needed him to be. He became genuinely charming. He learned to make people laugh. He volunteered at a crisis hotline, taking calls from people in the depths of despair, and his supervisor later said he was one of the most empathetic volunteers they had ever trained. He worked for the Washington State Republican Party and impressed everyone he met. He started law school. He had a serious girlfriend, a woman named Liz Klapfer, who adored him and who described him years later, even after everything, as the most magnetic person she had ever known. None of the people around him had any idea what was building underneath. He described it himself, in interviews conducted years later, as a compulsion that had been growing since adolescence, a dark fascination that fed on violent imagery, on crime coverage in newspapers, on what he called deviant material, and that grew slowly over years until it required something real to satisfy it. He was careful in those interviews to blame outside influences rather than anything innate in himself. Most investigators who studied him believed that was a performance, but the timeline he described, years of escalating compulsion before the first act of violence, matches what investigators eventually pieced together independently. In the early 1970s, women in the Seattle area began reporting a strange man. Someone who had approached them in parking lots on campuses near their apartments. Someone who was good-looking, well-dressed, and asked odd questions. Someone who made them uncomfortable in a way they struggled to explain, because he had not done anything, not exactly, and he seemed so normal. Police took some of these reports, filed them, did not connect them to each other. There was no reason to. They did not yet know they were all describing the same man, and that man, in January 1974, stopped approaching and started acting. Karen Sparks was 18 years old when Bundy broke into her apartment in the early hours of January 4, 1974. He beat her with a metal rod while she slept. She survived, barely, and with permanent injuries, but she had no memory of the attack and could not identify her attacker. A month later, on February 1st, 18-year-old Linda Ann Healy was taken from her bedroom in the night. Her blood-soaked nightgown and pillow were found neatly tucked back under her sheets. She was not found alive again. Over the next 6 months, young women began disappearing across Washington and Oregon at a pace that terrified investigators. Donna Manson, 19, vanished, walking to a concert on her college campus in March. Susan Rancourt, 18, disappeared from Central Washington State College in April. Roberta Parks, 22, vanished from Oregon State University in May. Brenda Ball, 22, was last seen leaving a tavern in June. Georgianne Hawkins, 18, disappeared from a well-lit alley 50 feet from her sorority house in June. Each time, no witnesses. No struggle, no trace, just a young woman who was there one moment and gone the next. And then, on July 14, 1974, something changed. At Lake Sammamish State Park, a busy recreational park outside Seattle, crowded with families on a sunny Sunday afternoon, multiple women independently reported being approached by the same man. He was handsome, brown-haired, well-dressed. His arm was in a sling. He introduced himself as Ted. He said he was having trouble loading his sailboat and asked if they could help him. Most women who were approached that day said no and walked away. Something about him felt off, though they struggled to say why. 2 women said yes. Janice Ott, 23, and Denise Nasland, 19, went with him separately over the course of the same afternoon. Neither was ever seen alive again. For the first time, investigators had a name, Ted, and a description, and absolutely nothing else. In the autumn of 1974, Bundy enrolled at the University of Utah College of Law in Salt Lake City and relocated. The killings followed him. Nancy Wilcox, 16, vanished in October. Melissa Smith, 17, the daughter of a local police chief, disappeared in October and was found strangled 9 days later. Laura Im, 17, vanished on Halloween night. And then, on November 8, 1974, something happened that almost ended everything much earlier than it did. Carol DeRonch was 18 years old, shopping at a mall in Murray, Utah, when a man approached her claiming to be a police officer. He told her someone had tried to break into her car and asked her to come with him to file a report. He was well-dressed. He showed what appeared to be a badge. She got into his Volkswagen Beetle. Within minutes, he had snapped a handcuff around her wrist and was pulling out a crowbar. She screamed, fought, threw open the passenger door, and ran into the road waving down a passing car. She survived. That same evening, 17-year-old Deborah Kent disappeared from a high school auditorium nearby, taken while everyone inside was watching a play. Her remains were not found until 2019. In Colorado, in January 1975, 23-year-old Karen Campbell vanished from a ski resort corridor between the elevator and her room while her fiancé waited for her downstairs. Her body was found the following month. More disappearances followed in Colorado. Julie Cunningham, Denise Oliverson, Melanie Cooley, Shelley Robertson. Women taken across a wide geographic area. No connection to each other except the man who took them. On August 16, 1975, a Utah Highway Patrol officer named Bob Hayward noticed a Volkswagen Beetle driving without its headlights near his home in Granger, Utah. He pulled it over. The driver was cooperative, friendly, and immediately suspicious. There was no good reason for him to be driving on that back road at that hour. A search of the vehicle turned up items the driver could not explain. A ski mask, a crowbar, handcuffs, rope, an ice pick, torn pantyhose. The driver's name was Ted Bundy. He said the ski mask was for skiing. He said the handcuffs were something he had found at a rubbish sale. Officers took the items as evidence and let him go. But the case file was forwarded to investigators working the Carol DeRonch abduction. She identified him in a lineup. He was arrested, tried for the DeRonch kidnapping, and convicted in March 1976. He was sentenced to 1 to 15 years in Utah State Prison. Investigators from Colorado then had him extradited to face murder charges in the death of Karen Campbell. In June 1977, during a court hearing in Aspen, Colorado, Ted Bundy asked permission to visit the courthouse law library. He was escorted to the second floor. When his escort stepped away for a moment, Bundy opened a window and jumped. He landed, stood up, walked into the town, broke into a cabin, stole food and clothing, and hiked into the mountains. He was at large for 6 days before being recaptured near a trailhead, half-starved and disoriented, and returned to custody. 6 months later, in December 1977, he escaped again, this time more carefully. He had been losing weight deliberately for weeks. He cut a hole in the ceiling of his cell, crawled through the space above it, found a gap above the jailer's apartment, dropped into the apartment while the jailer and his wife were out, changed into the jailer's clothes, and walked out the front door. He was not discovered missing for 15 hours. He drove a stolen car to Chicago, then took a bus to Atlanta, then another bus to Tallahassee, Florida, where he rented a room under a false name 2 blocks from the Florida State University campus. He was 31 years old. He had been free for less than 3 weeks when he struck again. In the early hours of January 15, 1978, Bundy entered the Chi Omega sorority house at Florida State University through an unlocked rear door. In approximately 15 minutes, he attacked 4 women in their beds. Lisa Levy, 21, and Margaret Bowman, 21, were beaten and strangled to death. Karen Chandler and Kathy Kleiner were beaten so severely that both sustained broken bones and serious head trauma, but survived. A 5th woman in the house heard sounds and locked her bedroom door. Bundy did not try to open it. He left the building, walked 8 blocks, and broke into the apartment of a student named Cheryl Thomas, whom he attacked in her bed. She survived but sustained permanent hearing loss and damage to her sense of balance that never fully recovered. 3 weeks later, on February 9, 1978, Bundy entered the grounds of Lake City Junior High School in Lake City, Florida. 12-year-old Kimberly Leach was seen being approached by a man and led away. She was the youngest of his confirmed victims. Her body was found 2 months later in an abandoned pig farm, partially decomposed. She had been abducted, assaulted, and killed. She was 12 years old and had been at school. 5 days after Kimberly Leach's disappearance, on February 15, 1978, a police officer in Pensacola, Florida, ran the plates on a Volkswagen Beetle driving erratically. The plates came back stolen. The officer attempted to stop the vehicle. The driver ran. The officer caught him after a brief struggle on the ground. The driver gave a false name. When his real identity was confirmed, the officer later said he felt physically ill. The man he had just arrested on a routine traffic stop was Ted Bundy. Bundy dismissed his lawyers and insisted on representing himself. He cross-examined witnesses, made legal arguments, and addressed the jury directly, conducting his own defense in front of a national television audience with a composure that many viewers found deeply unsettling. He was not brilliant in the courtroom. He made mistakes. His legal strategy was often confused, but he was controlled, articulate, and visually at complete odds with the nature of the crimes he was on trial for. Viewers who had not followed the case closely watched a polished, well-spoken man defend himself against charges that seemed, from the way he carried himself, almost implausible. The key physical evidence against him was a bite mark. Lisa Levy's body bore a distinctive bite mark on her left buttock. Forensic odontologist Dr. Tain, Richard Seweron, testified that the mark matched Bundy's teeth with specificity that went beyond coincidence. A plaster cast of Bundy's teeth, taken during his pre-trial detention, was presented alongside photographic overlays. It was the clearest, direct physical evidence placing him at the Chi Omega house. The jury convicted him of both Chi Omega murders and sentenced him to death. He was subsequently convicted of the murder of Kimberly Leach and sentenced to death a second time. Judge Edward Cowart, sentencing Bundy after the Chi Omega verdicts, said something that has been discussed ever since. He told Bundy it was a tragedy, that he had talent, that he could have had a distinguished legal career, that it was a shame things had come to this. He then sentenced him to die. Critics found the tone incomprehensible. It has been cited repeatedly as an example of the strange effect Bundy had on the people around him, even, apparently, the judge condemning him to death. While awaiting trial and during the proceedings, Bundy received an extraordinary volume of letters from women across the country, expressions of sympathy, attraction, and support. Women attended his hearings specifically to see him in person. A former acquaintance named Carol Ann Boone, who maintained throughout that he was innocent, moved to Florida to be closer to him. During his own testimony in the Kimberly Leach trial in 1980, Bundy proposed to her in open court, invoking a Florida statute that made a marriage declaration legally valid if made before a witness in a courtroom. She accepted. They were married. Boone subsequently gave birth to a daughter in 1982, the circumstances of which were never publicly confirmed, but which suggested someone at the prison had allowed them private time together. Boone eventually moved away from Florida with their daughter and cut off all contact with Bundy before his execution. Bundy spent nearly a decade on death row filing appeals, postponing his execution date repeatedly. In the final days before his execution, he began talking. He gave lengthy confessions to FBI agent Bill Hongmeier, with whom he had built a relationship over several years. He gave a televised interview to evangelical broadcaster James Dobson, in which he blamed pornography for his crimes, a statement that most investigators viewed as self-serving deflection rather than genuine explanation. and piece by piece he named victims. Not all of them. He confirmed 30 murders across 7 states. He described the locations of remains that families had been waiting years to find. He seemed, to those watching, to be trying to remain useful, trying to make himself valuable enough to delay the end a little longer. It did not work. On the morning of January 24, 1989, at exactly 7:06 a.m., Theodore Robert Bundy was executed in the electric chair at Florida State Prison in Rayford, Florida. He was 42 years old. Outside the prison gates, a crowd had gathered, not to protest, but to celebrate. People had driven from across Florida. They held signs. They set off fireworks. When the execution was announced, the crowd cheered. It was an unusual sight. But the Chi Omega murders had happened in Tallahassee, which was not far away. The families of victims had been waiting 11 years. The 30 murders Bundy confessed to are almost certainly not the full picture. Investigators believe the real number is at minimum 36 and may be considerably higher. He told FBI agent Hummeyer he had killed in states beyond what he admitted to publicly. There are cold cases across the Pacific Northwest and beyond that have never been formally closed. There are families who never received a confirmation, never got remains back, never got an answer. Bundy did not give them all one. Whether that was because he genuinely could not remember every victim, which is possible given the number and the years, or because he was keeping information back as leverage, has never been resolved. Following his execution, Bundy was cremated. His ashes were scattered, at his own prior request, in the Cascade Mountains of Washington state, the same mountain range where he had dumped the remains of several of his Washington victims, even in death on his own terms, controlling the ending. That is ultimately what the entire case of Ted Bundy comes down to, a man who spent his life engineering how other people perceived him, who killed 30 or more people while being described by everyone around him as warm and trustworthy and safe, and who managed, from a jail cell, to hold the attention of an entire country for a decade. The lesson is not that he was special. The lesson is that the charm was real, the warmth was real, and none of it told you anything about what was underneath. Subscribe for more. New episode every week.